The crisp autumn breeze rustled through the leaves as a small figure huddled beneath a thin blanket in the corner of St. Grace Children's Home. 10-year-old Danny pressed his face against the window, watching as another family drove away with their newly adopted child. His heart ached, but he forced himself to smile, happy that at least his friend had found a forever home. Danny had been at St. Grace's for 3 years now, ever since that terrible night when his parents never made it home from their anniversary dinner. The social workers tried their best to make the children feel loved, but with over 30 kids to care for, individual attention was hard to come by. Still, Danny never lost his spirit. He helped the younger children with their homework, shared his meager dessert portions with newcomers, and always had a kind word for anyone feeling down. What nobody knew was that every night, Danny would climb onto the roof of the old building, careful not to wake the others. There, under the stars, he would write stories in his worn notebook, tales of adventure, family, and dreams coming true. Writing was his escape, his way of creating the world he wished he could live in. Life at the orphanage followed a predictable routine until that unusually warm October morning. A sleek black car pulled up to the front gates, its polished surface reflecting the morning sun. The children pressed their faces against the windows, curious about this unexpected visitor. Out stepped a man in his early 50s, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, wearing not a business suit as everyone expected, but a comfortable sweater and jeans. This was Robert Chen, though the business world knew him as the founder of Global Tech Solutions, a company that had revolutionized renewable energy technology. Despite his billions, Robert carried himself with a humble demeanor that immediately put everyone at ease. He had come to St. Grace's not for a photo opportunity or to make a donation, but because something was missing in his life. Robert had achieved everything society deemed important: wealth, success, influence, but his massive house felt empty, his achievements hollow. After losing his wife to cancer 5 years ago, he had thrown himself into his work, building his company into a global powerhouse. But recently, he had started questioning what it was all for. Who would he share his success with? What legacy would he really leave behind? As Robert toured the facility, he noticed something unusual. While other children were playing in the common room or showing off for the potential parent, one boy sat in the corner, completely absorbed in writing in a tattered notebook. Curious, Robert approached him, careful not to startle the concentrated young writer. "What are you working on?" Robert asked softly. Danny looked up, surprised that anyone had noticed him. Usually, prospective parents gravitated toward the younger children or the more outgoing ones. "Just a story," he replied shyly, starting to close his notebook. "May I?" Robert gestured to the empty chair beside Danny. After receiving a tentative nod, he sat down. "I used to write stories too, you know. It helped me imagine a better future when things were tough." Danny's eyes widened with interest. "Really? What kind of stories did you write?" "Oh, all sorts. Adventures mostly. Stories about inventors and dreamers who changed the world." Robert smiled, remembering his own childhood dreams. "Would you share some of your story with me?" For the next hour, Robert sat there, completely engrossed as Danny read from his notebook. The story was about a lonely star that traveled the galaxy, helping other stars shine brighter until it finally found its own constellation, a family of stars that had been waiting just for them. As Danny read, Robert noticed several things: the boy's incredible creativity, his natural talent for storytelling, but most importantly, the pure empathy that shone through his words. Here was a child who, despite his own hardships, wrote about helping others find their light. Mrs. Thompson, the head of the orphanage, watched from the doorway with a knowing smile. She had known Danny since he arrived, had seen his gentle soul touch everyone around him. The way he looked after the younger children, how he never complained about his own situation, always finding ways to make others smile instead. That evening, as Robert prepared to leave, he found himself unable to step into his car. The thought of leaving Danny behind felt wrong, like walking away from a piece of his own heart. He turned back to Mrs. Thompson, who was seeing him out. "I know this isn't how it usually works," Robert began, his voice thick with emotion. "There are probably many procedures and paperwork to go through, but I'd like to start the adoption process. For Danny." Mrs. Thompson's eyes welled up with tears. "You know, Mr. Chen, in all my years here, I've never seen a better match. Danny deserves someone who sees his true worth, not just as another child to be adopted, but as the extraordinary person he is." As Robert drove home that night, his mind was already racing with plans. The spare room next to his study would make a perfect bedroom, with plenty of space for books and a proper writing desk. But more importantly, his heart felt lighter than it had in years. He knew this was just the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. Little did either of them know that this chance encounter would spark a series of events that would not only transform their lives but touch countless others in ways they could never imagine. The story of the lonely star finding its constellation was about to become real, though in a way neither Danny nor Robert could have predicted. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Robert threw himself into the adoption process with the same dedication he'd shown in building his company. He attended parenting classes, met with social workers, and began transforming his house into a home. Every spare moment was spent visiting Danny at St. Grace's, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. During one of their visits, Robert noticed Danny helping a younger child tie his shoelaces. The small act of kindness reminded him so much of his late wife's gentle nature that his eyes welled up with tears. When Danny looked up and caught him watching, Robert quickly wiped his eyes, but the boy's perceptive nature had already picked up on the emotion. "Are you okay?" Danny asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. Robert smiled, touched by the boy's empathy. "Yes, I am. You just reminded me of someone very special. Would you like to hear about her?" For the first time, Robert shared stories about his wife, Catherine. He told Danny about her passion for teaching, her love of gardening, and how she could always tell when someone needed a kind word or a warm hug. Danny listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed wisdom beyond his years. "She sounds amazing," Danny said softly. Do you think she would have liked me?" Robert's heart swelled with emotion. "She would have adored you. In fact, she always wanted us to adopt, but we never got the chance before she got sick." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Sometimes life has a way of bringing the right people together, even if the path getting there isn't what we expected. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Danny began sharing more about his own parents, memories he'd kept locked away for fear of the pain they might bring. He told Robert about his mother's chocolate chip pancakes on Sunday mornings, and how his father would make up silly songs about everything they did. As the adoption process progressed, Robert faced unexpected challenges. Some board members at his company expressed concerns about how adopting a child might affect his leadership. Others questioned his decision to adopt an older child. Robert addressed these concerns head-on during a board meeting. "I built this company with the vision of creating a better future," he told them firmly. "But what's the point of a better future if we're not nurturing the next generation who will inherit it? Danny has reminded me of what truly matters in life, and I believe this decision will make me a better leader, not a lesser one." His conviction silenced the critics, and many board members later approached him privately to express their support. One even shared his own adoption story, offering to help Danny adjust to his new life. Back at St. Grace's, the other children noticed the change in Danny. While happy for their friend, some couldn't help feeling a mix of emotions. During his final week at the orphanage, Danny found 6-year-old Lily crying in the reading corner. "What's wrong?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Everyone I like goes away," she sniffled. "First my mom, now you." Danny thought carefully before responding. "You know how I always write stories?" Lily nodded. Well, I'm going to write you a special story, and Mrs. Thompson will read it to you whenever you miss me. And guess what? I'll come back to visit and read you new stories too. That night, Danny stayed up late, writing a story about a brave little flower that helped other flowers grow, even during the toughest storms. He illustrated it with his colored pencils, pouring all his love and hope into every page. The day Danny left St. Grace's was filled with mixed emotions. Robert had arranged a small farewell party, complete with cake and ice cream for all the children. Mrs. Thompson couldn't hold back her tears as she hugged Danny goodbye, slipping a photo album into his backpack, a collection of memories from his time at the orphanage. The drive to his new home was quiet, both Danny and Robert lost in their thoughts. As they pulled up to the house, Robert noticed Danny's wide-eyed expression. "Too big?" he asked gently. Danny shook his head. "No, it's just different. Good different." "Wait until you see your room," Robert said with a smile. "I had some help designing it." As they walked through the house, Danny took everything in with quiet wonder. When they reached his room, Robert opened the door to reveal a space that perfectly balanced comfort with creativity. A cozy reading nook filled with books sat beneath a window overlooking the garden. A desk with a new laptop stood ready for writing, and the walls were painted with a subtle galaxy theme, complete with glow-in-the-dark stars. But what caught Danny's attention was the framed story on the wall, his story about the lonely star, professionally illustrated and bound. Below it hung a digital photo frame cycling through pictures, his parents from before, his times at St. Grace's, and recent photos with Robert. "This is your history," Robert explained softly. "All of it matters. All of it made you who you are. We're not replacing your past, we're building on it." Danny stood silently for a moment, taking it all in. Then, without warning, he turned and hugged Robert tightly. No words were needed, they both understood the magnitude of this moment. That evening, as they sat eating pizza on the couch, Robert had admitted he wasn't much of a cook. They began planning their future together. Danny expressed interest in learning about Robert's company, especially its environmental projects. Robert, in turn, suggested they could start a foundation to help other children in the foster system. "You know," Robert said thoughtfully, "running a business is a lot like writing a story. You have to imagine a better future and then work to make it real." Danny nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "And sometimes the best stories are the ones where people help each other?" "Exactly," Robert smiled. "Speaking of which, how would you feel about taking some cooking classes together? I think we both could use the help." As they laughed and made plans, neither could have imagined how their story would inspire others. The lonely star had indeed found its constellation, but this was just the beginning of their journey together. The first day of school arrived sooner than either Danny or Robert expected. Standing in front of Pine Grove Academy's imposing gates, Danny clutched his new backpack tightly. The private school's reputation for academic excellence had attracted children from the city's most privileged families, making Danny increasingly aware of his different background. "Remember," Robert said, kneeling to straighten Danny's collar, "you belong here just as much as anyone else. And you have something special that many don't, you know the value of kindness." Danny nodded, though his stomach was still doing flips. As he walked through the hallways to his fifth-grade classroom, he could feel the curious stares of other students. News of his adoption by Robert Chen had made local headlines, and whispers followed him like shadows. His new teacher, Mrs. Rivera, welcomed him warmly, having been briefed about his situation. She had arranged for a student named Peter to show Danny around. Peter, a quiet boy with glasses too big for his face, seemed just as nervous as Danny. "I like your notebook," Peter said during lunch, pointing to Danny's worn writing journal that he'd brought from St. Grace's. "Do you write stories too?" Just like that, a friendship began to bloom. Peter shared his own stories, mostly science fiction tales inspired by his love of astronomy. During breaks, they would sit under an old oak tree, trading stories and ideas, oblivious to the curious glances from their classmates. But school life wasn't without its challenges. During a parent-teacher conference, Danny overheard some parents discussing his adoption. "It's like something out of a movie," one mother whispered. "I wonder if Chen did it for the publicity." The word stung, but Danny remembered what Robert had told him about people sometimes speaking from ignorance rather than malice. Instead of letting it upset him, he channeled his feelings into his writing, creating a story about a phoenix rising from ashes, helping others find their wings. At home, Robert and Danny were settling into their own rhythm. Weekend mornings became sacred time for their cooking adventures, with more failures than successes at first. They learned to laugh at their mistakes, like the time they set off the smoke alarm trying to make French toast, or when their attempt at homemade pizza resulted in what they jokingly called rubber bread surprise. One evening, as they were cleaning up after another cooking experiment, Robert noticed Danny seemed distracted. "Everything okay, bud?" Danny was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Why did you really adopt me?" The question caught Robert off guard, but he knew it deserved complete honesty. "You know, when I first came to St. Grace's, I thought I was the one doing the choosing. But sitting there, listening to your story about the lonely star, I realized something: you chose me too. You showed me what I'd been missing in my life, the courage to be vulnerable, the joy of helping others, the power of sharing stories." Danny processed this, then shared what he'd overheard at school. Robert's expression softened with understanding. "You know what the best response to doubters is? Living well and proving them wrong through actions, not words." This conversation sparked an idea. That weekend, they visited St. Grace's together. Danny read his latest stories to the children, while Robert discussed with Mrs. Thompson the possibility of starting a creative writing program at the orphanage. Seeing the children's eyes light up during Danny's storytelling, Robert realized they'd found their mission. Over the next few months, their initiative grew. Robert hired writing teachers and provided supplies for weekly workshops at St. Grace's. Danny helped design the program, insisting that each child receive their own special notebook and pen, tools he knew from experience could open up worlds of possibility. The program's success attracted attention from other orphanages and foster homes. Soon, Robert and Danny found themselves launching Stories of Hope, a foundation dedicated to bringing creative writing programs to children in foster care across the city. Peter became a regular volunteer, teaching younger kids about science fiction writing. Other students from Pine Grove, inspired by Danny's dedication, began joining in. What started as one boy's passion for storytelling was transforming into a movement. Danny's own writing continued to flourish. His teachers were amazed by his ability to capture complex emotions in his stories, particularly in a piece he wrote about a tree that grew stronger with each storm it weathered. The story won first place in the school's literary contest, but more importantly, it helped another adopted student find the courage to share their own story. At home, Robert noticed subtle changes in their dynamic. Danny had started leaving little notes around the house, encouraging messages when Robert had tough days at work, silly jokes hidden in lunch bags, story ideas scribbled on post-its stuck to the bathroom mirror. These small gestures reminded Robert of Catherine's way of showing love through everyday actions. One night, after a particularly successful day at the foundation where 3 children had shared their stories for the first time, Danny found Robert in his study, looking at old photos. "I wish she could see all this," Robert said softly, touching a picture of Catherine. Danny sat beside him, thoughtful. "Maybe she can. Maybe she helped bring us together. Like in my star story, sometimes the stars we can't see anymore are still guiding us to where we need to be." Robert pulled Danny into a tight hug, marveling at how this young boy had brought such wisdom and light back into his life. Together, they were rewriting the story of what family could mean, proving that the strongest bonds aren't always formed by blood, but by choice, understanding, and love. Their story was beginning to impact others in ways they never expected. Local businesses started sponsoring writing programs, other wealthy individuals were inspired to consider adoption, and most importantly, children in foster care were finding their voices through storytelling. As spring approached, bringing new life to the garden Catherine had once tended, Robert and Danny planted a special tree, a symbol of their growing family and the roots they were putting down together. Under its branches, they continued to write their story, one day at a time, proving that sometimes the most beautiful chapters in life come after the hardest ones. As summer approached, the Stories of Hope Foundation had grown beyond anything Danny or Robert had imagined. What started as a simple writing program at St. Grace's had expanded to 15 different foster homes and orphanages across the city. But with success came new challenges that would test their growing family bond. One warm afternoon, while Robert was in a board meeting, he received an urgent call from Pine Grove Academy. Danny had gotten into an altercation with another student, something completely out of character for him. Racing to the school, Robert's mind filled with worry. He found Danny sitting outside the principal's office, a bruise forming under his right eye. Before Robert could say anything, Danny spoke quietly, "I'm sorry. I know I messed up." The story unfolded in Principal Chen's office. A new student had been making fun of some younger kids from the writing program who were visiting the school for a special workshop. When the bullies started tearing up their stories, Danny had stepped in. Though he hadn't thrown the first punch, he had pushed back when the other boy got physical. "While we understand Danny's intentions were good," the principal explained, "we have a zero-tolerance policy for physical confrontation." Robert listened carefully, then turned to Danny. "Can you tell me what was going through your mind?" Danny's voice trembled slightly. "Those kids, they reminded me, before you came. Writing was all they had, and he was destroying their stories. I couldn't just watch." Robert's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and concern. After a lengthy discussion, the principal agreed to have both boys participate in a restorative justice program instead of suspension. Danny would also need to write a reflection about alternative ways to handle conflict. On the drive home, Robert broke their thoughtful silence. "You know, standing up for others is admirable, but we need to talk about better ways to do it." That evening, over a dinner of slightly burnt stir-fry, they were still working on their cooking skills. They had a long conversation about power, responsibility, and choices. Robert shared stories from his early business days, when competitors had tried to bully him out of the market. "The strongest response isn't always the most forceful one," he explained. "Sometimes, it's about finding creative solutions that turn enemies into allies." This discussion sparked an idea. Danny spent the next week working on a special project, a story about a young peacemaker who protected others by building bridges instead of walls. He asked to share it at the next writing workshop, with the bullies class invited to attend. The story resonated deeply with both the young writers and their former tormentors. Several students from the bullies' circle even asked to volunteer with the foundation. Danny's approach to conflict resolution had transformed a negative situation into an opportunity for growth and understanding. As their foundation continued to expand, Robert noticed Danny spending more time helping other children develop their stories. He'd inherited Catherine's gift for nurturing others' talents, often staying late after workshops to encourage struggling writers. But Robert also sensed something was weighing on his son's mind. One night, as they sat in their favorite spot in the garden, Danny finally opened up. "Do you think my birth parents would be proud of me?" Robert took a moment to gather his thoughts. "You know, I believe they are. Every time you help another child find their voice, every time you stand up for what's right, even if the method needs some work," he added with a gentle smile, "you're honoring their memory by becoming an extraordinary person." Danny pulled out a worn photograph from his pocket, the last picture taken of him with his birth parents. "Sometimes I feel guilty," he admitted. "Like I'm betraying them by being happy with you." Robert's eyes welled up with tears. "Love doesn't work that way, buddy. It multiplies, it doesn't divide. Your capacity to love your birth parents and to love our family now, it makes you who you are. This conversation led to a new initiative for their foundation. They created a program called Heart Stories, where children in foster care could write letters to their birth parents or create memory books celebrating all the people who had impacted their lives. The program helped many children process their complex emotions about family and belonging. As summer progressed, Robert and Danny faced another challenge. A prominent business magazine wanted to do a feature story on their foundation, focusing on their father-son relationship. Danny was hesitant about the public attention, but Robert let him make the final decision. After careful consideration, Danny agreed to the interview, but with one condition: it had to include stories from other children in the program too. The resulting article, titled Writing New Chapters: How a Boy's Stories Changed a City, became a touching testament to the power of love, acceptance, and the written word. The article caught the attention of a national foster care organization, which invited Danny to speak at their annual conference. Despite his nervousness, he bravely shared his journey from orphan to advocate, reading excerpts from his stories and explaining how writing had helped him find his voice. His speech received a standing ovation, but what meant more to Danny were the conversations afterward with other foster children who felt inspired to share their own stories. One girl told him, "I never thought anyone would want to hear my story, but now I know it matters." Back at home, Robert found Danny adding a new entry to the journal they'd started together, a record of their family's journey. "You know what I realized?" Danny said, looking up from his writing. "Every story needs both light and shadow to be complete. The hard parts make the good parts shine brighter." Robert sat beside him, remembering how far they'd come from that first meeting at St. Grace's. "That's true in life too. Speaking of which, I think it's time we talked about our next adventure." Danny's eyes lit up with curiosity. Robert pulled out some papers from his briefcase, plans for expanding their foundation nationally, with a special focus on helping foster children pursue their creative dreams through college scholarships. "What do you think?" Robert asked. "Ready to help more stars find their constellations?" Danny's smile said everything. Together, they were not just changing lives, they were showing the world that family could be found in the most unexpected places, and that every child's story deserved to be heard. The autumn wind scattered golden leaves across the garden as Robert sat alone in his study, staring at the medical report on his desk. The doctor's words echoed in his mind: early stages, treatable, need to start immediately. The same illness that had taken Catherine was now threatening to take him away from Danny. For a week, Robert carried this burden alone, not wanting to worry his son. But Danny, with his uncanny ability to read people, sensed something was wrong. He noticed the subtle changes, the missed dinners, the quiet sighs, the way Robert would sometimes stop and stare into distance during their conversations. One evening, as they worked on foundation paperwork together, Danny finally confronted him. "Dad," he said, the words still new and precious between them, "remember what you told me about family sharing both the good and the hard things?" Robert looked up, surprised by the gentle challenge in Danny's voice. His son's eyes held the same wisdom that had first drawn him to the boy at St. Grace's. With a heavy heart, he shared the diagnosis. Danny's reaction wasn't what Robert expected. Instead of breaking down, the boy grabbed his writing journal and began to furiously scribble. After a few minutes, he read aloud, "Once there was a warrior who fought battles for others but forgot he didn't have to fight alone. His greatest strength wasn't in his sword, but in the army of hearts that stood behind him." Tears rolled down Robert's cheeks as Danny continued, "You're not alone in this fight, Dad. We're a constellation now, remember?" The next few months transformed their lives in unexpected ways. Danny took on more responsibility with the foundation, showing maturity beyond his years. He organized writing workshops from home when Robert had treatments, and coordinated with Mrs. Thompson to ensure their programs continued running smoothly. The foundation work provided a powerful distraction for both of them. They were in the midst of launching their national expansion, with new writing programs starting in 5 different states. Danny's story about the warrior became part of a special collection they published, with proceeds going to cancer research. One day, while Robert was resting after a treatment session, he received an unexpected call from Mrs. Thompson. A couple who had read about their foundation wanted to meet them, the parents of one of Danny's old friends from St. Grace's. The meeting was arranged at their home the following weekend. When the couple arrived with their adopted daughter, Lily, the same little girl Danny had written a special story for when he left the orphanage, the connection was instant. Now 8 years old, Lily had kept every story Danny had sent her over the past year. "Your stories helped me be brave," Lily told Danny, pulling out a small notebook of her own. "Now I write stories too, and I read them to other kids at St. Grace's." This reunion sparked a new initiative. Danny and Lily began collaborating on a series of stories specifically for children dealing with family illnesses. Their first book, When Stars Need Extra Shine, helped kids understand and cope with having a sick parent. As Robert's treatment progressed, their home became a hub of activity. Other parents from their foundation network, many of whom had gone through similar health challenges, formed a support system. They took turns helping with foundation work, driving Robert to treatments, and ensuring Danny could maintain his school routine. Peter, Danny's best friend from school, started a student committee to help with foundation administrative work. The committee organized fundraising events and created a mentorship program pairing high school students with younger writers from the foundation. One particularly tough evening, after a long day of treatment, Robert found Danny in Catherine's garden. The boy was planting something by moonlight. "What are you doing out here so late?" Robert asked, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. "Planting hope," Danny replied, patting the soil around a small seedling. "Mom's garden needs new flowers for spring." The way he said "Mom," referring to Catherine, filled Robert's heart with warmth. "You know," Danny continued, "in all my stories, the characters get scared sometimes, but they never give up. They just need to remember they're part of something bigger than themselves." Robert sat beside him in the garden, marveling at how their roles had shifted. While he fought his illness, Danny had become his source of strength, just as he had once been Danny's anchor in a stormy world. The foundation's national expansion continued to gain momentum. Other business leaders, inspired by their story, began sponsoring similar programs in their own cities. Danny's original story about the lonely star finding its constellation was now being translated into different languages, touching lives across borders. During one of their regular video calls with other foundation locations, a young girl from a Chicago foster home shared how the writing program had helped her reconnect with her estranged brother through letters. Another boy in Houston had used his stories to help his foster parents better understand his experiences. These success stories became Robert's medicine, giving him additional strength to fight his illness. His doctors were amazed by his resilience, noting that patients with strong support systems often showed better recovery rates. As winter approached, Robert received promising news: the treatments were working better than expected. The day they got the results, Danny organized a surprise celebration, gathering their extended foundation family in their home. Looking around at the room full of people whose lives they'd touched, children finding their voices through writing, parents discovering new ways to connect with their kids, volunteers who'd become like family, Robert realized that their story had grown far beyond what either of them could have imagined. That night, after everyone had left, Danny brought Robert a new journal. On the first page, he had written, "The best stories never really end, they just keep growing, one heart at a time." Together, they began writing their next chapter, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else, with love, creativity, and the understanding that every star, no matter how dim it might feel sometimes, has the power to light up the entire sky. Spring arrived with renewed hope as Robert's health continued to improve. The garden Catherine had loved so much burst into bloom, now tended by both father and son. Among the fresh flowers stood the seedling Danny had planted during those dark winter nights, a young cherry tree that had somehow survived against the odds. As Robert grew stronger, Danny faced a milestone of his own. His teachers had recommended him for a prestigious young writers' conference in New York, where he would represent their foundation and share their story with a national audience. While excited, Danny struggled with leaving his father, even for a few days. "What if something happens while I'm gone?" Danny asked, sitting in their favorite spot in the garden. Robert smiled, his color much better than it had been in months. "Sometimes being strong means knowing when to spread your wings. Besides, I've got our whole foundation family watching over me. Did you know Peter's mom is making her famous chicken soup for the whole week you're gone?" The conference proved to be a turning point for both of them. Danny's speech about their journey touched hearts across the country. He spoke about finding family in unexpected places, about how stories could build bridges between people, and about the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. A surprise awaited Danny after his speech. A group of international educators had been in the audience, and they saw the potential to take the Stories of Hope Foundation global. They proposed partnering with schools and orphanages across different countries, using storytelling to help children process trauma and build connections. Meanwhile, back home, Robert had his own surprise in the works. Using the time alone to finalize some long-term plans, he worked with his company's board to create a sustainable future for their foundation. Global Tech Solutions would dedicate a percentage of its annual profits to fund writing programs and scholarships for foster children. When Danny returned home, bubbling with excitement about the international interest in their program, he found Robert in Catherine's garden, looking healthier than he had in months. "The doctor called," Robert announced, his eyes shining. "The latest tests show no signs of the disease. I'm in remission." Their celebration dinner that night turned into an impromptu gathering as news spread through their foundation family. Mrs. Thompson brought a cake, Peter and his parents arrived with their signature soup, and several children from their writing programs came with handmade cards. During the celebration, Danny pulled Robert aside to share something he'd been working on throughout his time in New York. It was a new story, different from anything he'd written before. This one was about a garden where flowers of all kinds grew together, supporting each other through storms and sharing sunshine in good times. "It's about us," Danny explained. "Not just you and me, but all of us. The foundation, St. Grace's, our volunteers, everyone who's become part of our family. We're like Catherine's garden, different flowers growing stronger together." The story sparked an idea for their foundation's next phase. They would help foster homes and orphanages around the world create their own gardens alongside their writing programs. These Hope Gardens would give children a chance to nurture life while nurturing their creativity. The first Hope Garden was planted at St. Grace's, with Danny and Robert working alongside the children to create a special space where stories and flowers could grow together. During the planting, Lily, now a regular presence at their events, organized the younger children into teams, showing the same nurturing spirit that Danny had once shown her. As their foundation prepared to go international, they received an unexpected letter. It was from the boy who had bullied the young writers at Pine Grove Academy the previous year. He had moved to another state but had started a writing club at his new school, inspired by how Danny had handled their conflict. "Your son taught me that everyone has a story worth telling," he wrote to Robert. "Even the people we think are our enemies. I want to help other kids learn what I learned." This letter became the catalyst for a new branch of their program focused on conflict resolution through storytelling. Danny worked with education experts to develop workshops that help children understand different perspectives through creative writing. One evening, as they sat in the garden reviewing proposals for new international locations, Danny noticed Robert looking thoughtfully at Catherine's photograph on his desk. "What are you thinking about?" Danny asked. "I was just thinking about how life writes the best stories," Robert replied. "When I lost your mom, I thought my story was over. Then you came along and showed me it was just beginning a new chapter. Now look at us, we're helping write new chapters for children all over the world. Danny picked up a flower that had fallen from the cherry tree he'd planted during Robert's illness. You know what I've learned? The best stories are like gardens. They need both rain and sunshine to grow. And sometimes, the most beautiful flowers bloom in places where you least expect them. Their conversation was interrupted by a video call from a partner organization in Japan. A group of children there had translated Danny's original star story into Japanese and created their own illustrations. As they watched the children proudly share their work, Robert and Danny saw their vision becoming reality, stories transcending languages and borders to connect hearts across the world. That night, Danny added a new entry to their family journal. Sometimes the biggest changes in life start with the smallest acts of kindness. A story shared, a hand held out, a heart open to new possibilities. Today, our constellation grows bigger, stretching across oceans and continents, but its light still starts from the same place, the moment two lonely stars found their way home. As they planned the Foundation's international launch, they remained grounded in their core mission, helping children find their voices and their families, whether through blood or through bonds of the heart. Their story had become more than just a tale of a millionaire adopting an orphan. It was proof that love, when shared, multiplies beyond measure. 5 years had passed since that first meeting at St. Grace's, and the old building was hardly recognizable anymore. The once faded walls now displayed vibrant murals of storytellers and dreamers, while the Hope Garden bloomed with flowers from around the world. Each plant had been sent by children from different countries who had become part of their growing Foundation family. On this particular morning, Danny, now 15, stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie. Today marked the official launch of the Stories of Hope Foundation's global initiative, and representatives from 20 countries had gathered to celebrate. But for Danny and Robert, the day held an even deeper significance. Ready for the big day? Robert asked, appearing in the doorway of Danny's room. Now fully recovered, he carried himself with renewed energy, though his hair had turned completely silver. Almost, Danny replied, looking at a photo on his desk. It showed 3 moments frozen in time: his birth parents smiling at a park, young Danny first arriving at St. Grace's, and a recent picture of him and Robert in Catherine's garden. Just remembering how it all started. The celebration was being held at St. Grace's, transforming the orphanage into an international hub of hope. Children from local foster homes mingled with educators from across the globe, while screens displayed live video connections with partner locations worldwide. Mrs. Thompson, now the Foundation's Global Outreach Director, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched Danny guide a group of young writers through the Hope Garden. Each child carried a notebook, a tradition that had started with Danny's worn journal and had now spread to thousands of children worldwide. The garden had become a living symbol of their journey. The cherry tree Danny had planted during Robert's illness now stood tall and strong, its branches providing shade for young writers. Beneath it, children from different backgrounds sat together, sharing stories in multiple languages, their laughter a universal melody. Robert took the stage to open the ceremony, but what happened next wasn't part of the planned program. A group of children from their very first writing workshop, now teenagers themselves, had prepared a surprise. They took turns reading from the stories Danny had helped them write years ago, each one followed by an update on how their lives had changed. "Danny taught us that our past doesn't define our future," one girl said, her voice strong and clear. "But it gives us the words to write a better one." The surprise continued as video messages played from children around the world. A boy from a Brazilian favela shared how the writing program had helped him win a scholarship. A group of young Syrian refugees performed a play they had written about finding hope in difficult times. A girl from a small village in India showed the library she had started after being inspired by their foundation. When it was Danny's turn to speak, he pulled out his old notebook, the same one he'd been writing in when Robert first met him. 5 years ago, I wrote a story about a lonely star searching for its constellation, he began. I never imagined that story would travel around the world, helping other lonely stars find their way home." He shared how their foundation had evolved, growing from a simple writing program into a global movement. They had established scholarship funds for foster children, created writing therapy programs for trauma recovery, and built a network of support that transcended borders and cultures. But the real magic, Danny continued, isn't in the programs or the buildings. It's in the moments when a child realizes their story matters. When they find their voice and use it to light the way for others. The ceremony's highlight came with the announcement of their newest initiative, the Catherine Chen Legacy Project. Robert had dedicated a significant portion of his fortune to ensure that every child in foster care would have access to creative writing programs, therapy through storytelling, and opportunities for education. "My late wife believed that every child deserves a chance to write their own story," Robert explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Through this project, her love will continue to touch lives for generations to come." As the formal ceremony concluded, the celebration moved into the Hope Garden. Children led tours, proudly showing visitors the flowers they had planted and sharing the stories behind each one. The garden had become a living library, where every plant told a tale of resilience and hope. Later that evening, as the international guests departed and the excitement quieted, Danny and Robert sat in their favorite spot in the garden. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of purple and gold, reminiscent of the day they first met. "You know what I realized today?" Danny said, looking at the cherry tree. "Every story we write becomes a seed. We might not always see where it takes root or how it grows, but somewhere, it's giving someone hope." Robert nodded, thinking of how their simple story of finding family had blossomed into something far greater than either of them had imagined. "And every person who reads it becomes part of our constellation." A soft breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the scent of blooming flowers. In the distance, they could hear children's voices from St. Grace's, where a new group of young writers was sharing stories after dinner, a tradition that had continued every evening since their program began. "Dad," Danny said quietly, "do you think this is the kind of story Mom would have liked?" Robert smiled, his eyes glistening. "She would have loved it. Because it's not just our story anymore, it belongs to everyone who's ever felt lost and found their way home through words." As night fell, the garden lit up with thousands of tiny solar lights, another of Danny's ideas, inspired by his star story. Each light represented a child who had found their voice through their program, creating a constellation of hope that stretched across the globe. They had learned that family wasn't just about blood or adoption papers. It was about the connections we create, the stories we share, and the love we choose to give. Their journey had shown that sometimes the most powerful changes start with the simplest acts, a story shared, a hand held out, a heart open to new possibilities. In the end, their story wasn't just about a millionaire adopting an orphan. It was about how two lonely hearts found each other and, in healing themselves, helped heal others. It was about the power of words to build bridges, the strength of love to overcome challenges, and the magic that happens when we believe in the power of every person's story. As they walked back home under the starlit sky, Danny and Robert knew that while this chapter of their story was ending, countless new ones were just beginning. In orphanages, foster homes, and communities around the world, children were opening notebooks, picking up pens, and beginning to write their own stories of hope.